2nd April 1945. Bavaria, Germany. The war is almost over, but no one told him that. He stood at the gate with his arms crossed and his boots polished. Not a scratch on him, not a day of real fighting behind him. Just a uniform, a club, and a long history of deciding who got bread and who didn't. The prisoners shuffled past in columns, hollow eyes, ribs pressing through striped cloth. Men who had been engineers, teachers, fathers, reduced to things that shuffled. He laughed, not nervously, not out of discomfort. He laughed the way a man laughs at something beneath him. 30 feet away, a jeep idled on the road. The man inside it watched. He didn't move yet. He didn't speak yet. But his jaw tightened, and something behind his eyes went very, very still. He remembered that laugh for months, and when the moment came, he did not forget the face that made it. This is what he did. We tell stories where disrespect meets its consequence. If that's the channel you've been looking for, subscribe. Every story here ends with accountability. His name was Hauptsturmführer Wilhelm Deckert, a captain, camp administrator, a man whose greatest talent was paperwork and cruelty. He had never charged a hill, never bled in a trench. He had arrived at this posting in 1943 with pressed gloves and a letter of recommendation from a party official in Munich. He had spent the war behind wire, not as a prisoner, but as a warden. His office smelled of pipe tobacco and floor wax. Inside the camp, it smelled of something else entirely. Deckert kept records. Who worked, who couldn't, who got the daily ration, and who got it docked for insubordination. He had a system. He was proud of it. He called it order. The prisoners had another word for it, but they were not permitted to speak. He lived 2 kilometers from the camp in a requisitioned house that had belonged to a Jewish family before 1939. The kitchen still had their mezuzah mark on the doorpost. Deckert had painted over it, but the outline was still visible if you looked close enough. He ate well. He slept well. Every morning he dressed carefully. Every morning he walked to the gate and watched the prisoners move to labor detail. He had favorites, not to protect, but to single out. There was one man, a former professor from Krakow, tall, thin, still carried himself with a kind of dignity that Deckert found personally offensive. He had the man beaten twice for failing to show proper deference. The professor did not break. That infuriated Deckert more than anything, so he laughed instead, as if the whole thing were a joke, as if the man's suffering were a punchline only Deckert could hear. The guards under his command followed his tone. You always follow the tone of the man above you. That is how institutions become cruel, not by policy alone, but by permission, by the sound of one man laughing and everyone else deciding that means it's allowed. By April 1945, Deckert's institution had processed over 4,000 prisoners. Fewer than 900 were still alive. The jeep stopped. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, had been touring the advance. His staff had received a report about a camp near the road, one of dozens they were encountering now. They were supposed to document and move on. Patton got out of the jeep. His aide moved to follow. Patton held up one hand. Stay. He walked through the gate alone. The smell hit him first. Even veterans, men who had been through North Africa, through Sicily, through the Bulge, stopped moving when they entered these places. Something in the body refuses before the mind catches up. Patton did not stop moving, but his color changed. A soldier near the gate noticed the general and snapped to attention. Patton walked past him without a word. He moved down the main path between the barracks. Prisoners watched from doorways. Some were too weak to stand. Some reached toward him, not desperately, just instinctively, the way people reach toward anything that looks like it came from outside. He stopped in front of one man. The man was seated against the wall of a barracks building. His hands rested on his knees. He was looking at the ground. Patton crouched down. "What's your name, son?" The man looked up. His eyes were the color of old ash. He said something in Polish. A translator was 15 feet back. Patton didn't wait for him. He just put one hand on the man's shoulder and stayed there for a moment. Then he stood and he turned, and his face was a different face now. He found Deckert 20 minutes later. Deckert was in his office. He had heard the Americans were near. He had changed into civilian clothes, a brown jacket, no insignia, and he was standing near the window pretending to read a ledger. The door opened without a knock. Patton stood in the frame. Deckert straightened instinctively, old reflex, then caught himself and tried to look casual. "I'm just an administrator," he said in German. "I have documentation." Patton looked at the desk. He looked at the pipe resting in the ashtray. He looked at the coat on the hook behind the door. The uniform coat Deckard hadn't quite had time to hide. He looked at Deckard, hadn't quite had time to hide. He looked at Deckard. He said nothing for 5 full seconds. One of Patton's officers entered behind him. "Sir, we found the records." "How many?" Patton said. The officer hesitated. "We're still counting, sir." Deckard tried to speak again. Patton raised one finger, not a gesture of command, not anger, just stop. That single finger was the quietest and most devastating thing in the room. Deckard stopped. Later that afternoon, one of Patton's men found the professor from Krakow, the one Deckard had beaten twice. He was still alive, just barely. They brought him water. He couldn't hold the cup. A young private named Callahan, 19 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, sat next to him and held the cup himself. "Easy?" Callahan said. "Easy, sir." The man hadn't been called that in 2 years. He turned his face toward the wall so the boy wouldn't see him cry. Patton did not leave. Most commanders would have passed the situation to military police and continued the advance. There were battles still being fought 40 miles north. There were reports waiting. There were decisions that only he could make. He stayed. He ordered his staff to establish a processing point at the camp entrance. He ordered medical personnel forward. He walked every building personally, every barracks, every work shed, every room that had a lock on the outside. He did not take notes. He did not speak much. He watched. His aide, Captain Chester Hansen, recorded that Patton's expression during this time was not anger. It was something more controlled than anger. Anger passes. This was something that had settled in, the way a stone settles to the bottom of cold water. He returned to Deckard at dusk. Deckard had been held in his own office. The irony was not lost on anyone. Patton entered. He set the record ledger on the desk in front of Deckard. He opened it to a specific page. "Read it," Patton said. Deckard looked at the page. His own handwriting. Rows of names. Notations beside each. Transferred. Unable to work. Deceased. Patton tapped the page. "Read it out loud." Silence. "I won't ask again." Deckard began to read. His voice shook before he finished the first name. Patton stood at the window, with his back turned, looking out at the camp yard where his medical teams were still working in the last of the light. He listened to every name. He did not turn around. The next morning, Patton issued a single order. Every German civilian living within 5 kilometers of the camp, the town of Neuhausen, was to report to the camp. All of them. Men, women, shopkeepers, farmers, the mayor, the school teacher, the women who said they didn't know. They arrived in their good clothes. Some brought hats. One woman carried a handbag. They were led inside. Every building. Every room. The evidence that had been building for 2 years, the weight of it, the smell of it, the human cost of it, they were walked through all of it, personally, without being allowed to look away. Patton stood at the entrance and watched them go in. He watched their faces when they came back out. Some wept, some couldn't stand. One man vomited near the gate and then stood there shaking, not moving, not sure what to do with what he had just seen. Patton stopped him. "Did you know?" he said. The man didn't answer. "Did you know?" The man's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Patton leaned in close. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "You knew." He stepped back. The man was not arrested. He was not charged that day. He was simply sent home, to live in a town 2 kilometers from what he had permitted by looking away. That was the point. Not punishment in the traditional sense. Accountability of a different kind, the kind you carry. As for Deckard, he was formally arrested, documented, and handed to military justice. His records became evidence. His ledger, his careful, organized, handwritten ledger, was used against him in proceedings that followed. The last thing Patton said to him was not a verdict. It was a question. Was it worth it? Deckard said nothing. Patton nodded once, as if the silence confirmed everything he already believed. Then he left. In the days that followed, the camp was transformed. Not quickly. Nothing real happens quickly, but steadily. Medical teams worked around the clock. Supply convoys brought food, medicine, blankets. Doctors who had been hardened by years of battlefield surgery found themselves undone by what they saw here. One surgeon, Dr. Tomben, Marcus Webb of the 35th Medical Battalion, wrote home to his wife 4 days after arriving, "I have seen what men can do to each other in war. I was not prepared for what men can do to each other in peace." The professor from Krakow, his name was Alexander WWII, regained enough strength to sit up after 3 days. On the 4th day, he asked for a pencil and paper. A nurse brought him what she could find, a short pencil, half a notepad. He began to write, not a letter, not a complaint. He wrote names, every name he could remember from his block. Men who had come in, men who had not come out. He wrote for 6 hours straight. When the pencil wore down, he asked for another. He was building a record, because someone had to, and he was still alive, and that meant it fell to him. By the time American authorities formally processed the camp, WWII had produced 11 pages of names, dates, and details that no official ledger contained. 12 of those names were later used to identify victims whose families had received no information. 12 families learned the truth because a man with a half-length pencil refused to let names disappear. Deckard stood trial in the autumn of 1945. His own ledger, the one he had maintained with such administrative pride, served as primary evidence against him. Every notation, every transfer, every euphemism. His defense argued he was following orders. The tribunal noted he had signed each entry personally. He received a sentence of 15 years hard labor. He served 11 before dying in custody in 1956. No one came to collect his body. Up south, the town of Neuhausen was required to contribute labor to the reconstruction of the camp, converting it into a displaced persons facility for survivors awaiting repatriation. The townspeople who had walked through those buildings now worked to make them livable. Some of them wept again while they worked. Whether from guilt or grief or both, no one could say, and perhaps the distinction no longer mattered. Patton left the area within a week. The advance continued. There were still hundreds of miles of war to finish. He had reports to file, orders to give, a front line that didn't pause for grief. But Captain Hansen noted something in his diary that week. Something small. He wrote, "The general has been quiet, not his usual quiet before a fight. A different kind. The kind that means something has been added to what he carries." Hansen didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Deckard's laugh lasted maybe 3 seconds. A guard at a gate. A moment of casual contempt, something he probably forgot about before he got back to his office. But the man in the Jeep didn't forget. That's what this story is really about. Not the punishment, not the army, not the machinery of justice. It's about what happens when one person refuses to treat cruelty as background noise. We live in a world that is very good at asking us to look away, to tell ourselves it's not our business, to decide that what's happening over there doesn't touch us over here. Deckard's town was 2 kilometers from that camp. 2 kilometers. The smell reached them on the right kind of wind. They knew. Patton's act wasn't just military justice. It was a refusal to let anyone claim ignorance as a shield. It was the insistence that seeing, really seeing, carries a moral weight you cannot put back down. The professor's pencil. The private who said, "Sir." The general who stayed when he could have kept moving. These are not grand gestures. They are choices, every one of them made in a moment that didn't have to go that way. So let me ask you something. If you had been in that Jeep, if you had seen that guard laugh at those prisoners, what would you have done? Most people say, "I would have acted." But Deckard's town said the same thing, before they were ever tested. The difference wasn't what they believed about themselves. It was what they did when the moment actually came. Drop your answer in the comments. Be honest. We read them all. And if this kind of story matters to you, the ones history almost buried, the ones where ordinary people made extraordinary choices, subscribe. We find them every week, because some stories don't get to disappear.